Hello and welcome. Today we're visiting Freedom House. Freedom House is a non-governmental organisation that was founded in 1941. It's the oldest American organisation devoted to defending democracy and freedom around the world. Beginning in 1973, Freedom House has systematically tracked the most pressing threats to democracy and freedom around the globe through the Freedom in the World reports. And today we're joined by a co-author of the Freedom in the World report, research manager and senior research analyst at Freedom House, Cathryn Grothe. Welcome, Cathryn. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Cathryn, for having me. So happy to be here.
I wondered if we could maybe board a plane with our listeners of Save Democracy, given you have a wonderful overview of the world in terms of the trends in democracy and autocracy, given your day job. And if you could take us around the world in our plane and just give us a bit of a description, an overview of the trends with regards to democracy v. autocracy in the world, that would be great.
The major trend, and this is really looking back over the last 20 years, is that freedom has been declining around the world. And this is in every region, in every regime type. And I think it's important to make the distinction when we talk about freedom and democracy and autocracy. I think often you see people saying freedom has declined and democracy has declined, and using these two things interchangeably. You'll hear me talk a lot about the decline in freedom. And when we talk about that, we're looking specifically at, political rights and civil liberties. So this is what everyday people are able to access in their lives. Political rights, meaning the ability to participate in free and fair elections, civil liberties being the ability to access an independent media and exercise their right to free assembly and free expression. Whereas when we talk about democracy and autocracy, these are systems of government. And of course, in democracy, there are higher levels of freedom, whereas in an autocracy, there are lower levels of freedom. So these things are very much related. We're seeing democracies backslide around the world, and more autocratic places are deepening repression. They're getting more and more less free. And this is what's really driving this decline in freedom around the world. At Freedom House, we classify kind of different regime types into three categories. That is free countries, partly free countries, and not free. Free countries are your established democracies. Not free countries are more of your entrenched authoritarian countries. Partly free countries, these are more of your hybrid regimes, countries that are more in transition. You can think of places like India or Hungary, Indonesia, or Kenya. One of the trends that we've seen that's been really concerning over the last 20 years is that this kind of cohort of partly free countries has been shrinking. And it's not because, unfortunately, these countries are transitioning into democracies. So this is really disproving kind of some of the predictions that have been made in the early 2000s about the global momentum towards liberalization. Rather, these countries are more and more falling into authoritarianism. So while, the group of countries that were rated free 20 years ago, that cohort is largely stayed the same, showing, one piece of good news that democracies are rather resilient. Unfortunately, this group of kind of gray zone countries in transition or hybrid regimes are increasingly moving towards authoritarianism, and it's creating this sort of bipolar world where we have more and more entrenched autocracies pushing against democracies. I guess finally, maybe I'll end with some good news, and I just alluded to this, and that is that democracies do remain resilient. And I think many people around the world are continuing to call for freedom, even in some of the most repressive places around the world. More than I think it's 85% of the countries that were rated free in 2005 were still rated free in our index 20 years later. So it really does show that countries that are able to reach that kind of level of established democracy tend to stay there. So it does just show kind of that level of resiliency of democracy. And even in some of the most repressive environments, these are places like Iran and like China, citizens continue to mobilize for political rights, call for accountable governments, and call for personal dignity. We seen this time and time again in places like Iran, where despite the risks, you continue to see people going to the streets and calling for their freedom, despite the brutal crackdowns. We saw this just most recently in early January. You continue to see this even in very small scale forms of dissent in China, where self-censorship is so rampant, but you continue to see, people in the ways that they can pushing back against the massive, massive censorship apparatus there to try to inform people about their rights and liberties. So I'll stop there, but I think, despite kind of most of the negative news around the trends in democracy and freedom, there are still some of these kind of bright spots that I like to try to highlight.
So I think what we like to try to understand is the extent to which democracy is backsliding and what are the forces that underpin that, and what, if anything, individuals can do, and we can come to that at the end before we close. If we look across the world, if we look at, say, maybe the major democracies in the world with the biggest populations, in the last 20 years, could you speak to the extent to which there is evidence of backsliding?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly one that is top of mind here in the US. I think, so just to kind of talk about some of the drivers of decline more broadly, and then I'll talk specifically about democratic backsliding. So the reasons that we've seen this 20-year decline in global freedom, two of those reasons are kind of time-bound, very obvious and evident things, and those are coups d'etats and conflicts. Those are things that, get headlines, that raise alarms, that are very easy to see with your eyes, and it's very clear how they erode freedom, political rights, and civil liberties. The other two are the erosion of democratic institutions, what we'll talk about, and then deepening repression in already authoritarian countries. And those things are a lot harder to quantify or to kind of see. And this is because they happen slowly over time. I think you actually recently had a guest on who kind of described what we call the erosion of democratic institutions, but who described this as autocratic legalism. I would encourage folks to listen to that episode. It was really great. And I'll kind of echo what she said, which is that, democracies don't disappear overnight. More often, they're weakened kind of piece by piece until meaningful accountability no longer exists. I think the places you'll hear that are most emblematic of this are Venezuela, Turkey, Hungary. One place that is continuing to happen where you can kind of see this in real time is El Salvador. So President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador was elected through relatively free and fair competitive elections. He came to power and was very popular and actually remains relatively popular because he ran on a platform of cracking down on violent crime and non-state actors, which was a very major problem in El Salvador. And he did do that. However, at the cost of really eroding El Salvador's democratic institutions by cleaning up kind of some of the problem caused by major drug-related violence. He completely co-opted the judiciary. He eroded due process. There was a very, very extended state of exceptions, or kind of like a state of emergency there. And even after, physical security was returned and a lot of the violence had quelled in El Salvador, a lot of these kind of measures remained in place. And then we saw President Bukele start to do some things very piecemeal, kind of under the guise of legality, that cemented his power. These were things like changing the Constitution to remove term limits, which just happened. It was, using anti-corruption bodies and the judiciary to go after political opponents. And slowly over time, the last elections were very less free and fair than the first ones. And El Salvador today does not look anything like it does when Bukele came to power. The level of decline that we've seen in honestly pretty rapid amount of time compared to other examples, even in Hungary, I would say, is quite staggering. But I think that this should serve as a warning sign to other democracies that could be undergoing this. You know, autocrats don't just instantly turn a democratic country into an authoritarian state overnight. It does happen often through these piecemeal efforts that do look legal. Things like holding constitutional referendums, having people vote to remove term limits is something that is seen all over the world at an alarming rate to slowly erode these institutions. This is a playbook that we have seen in Hungary that was really tried and true, perfected by Viktor Orban, as well as President Erdogan in Turkey. This is something that leaders all around the world have kind of tried again and again, some to success, and in some cases not, where we've seen democratic institutions be able to push back against these efforts.
Yeah, and that speaks to the recent election in Hungary and how the civil society and the media and political actors working together managed to get it over the line and oust the Orban regime. And I just wondered if you can speak to the Hungarian example as to lessons for us about how they were able to reclaim their democracy.
Yes, I mean, I think lots of people who follow this space were certainly watching Hungary with bated breath, and time will still tell, what is going to happen. I think one thing that we have learned from places like Poland or Guatemala, where there have been years, if not decades, of democratic erosion, where institutions have been chipped away, is that the road to recovery is long. Much like with coups or any other effort to kind of break down democratic institutions, building them back up takes a lot longer. It can be quite quick to, even do a constitutional referendum and get rid of term limits, or obviously with a coup, even faster. But the efforts of, rebuilding, let's say, a co-opted judiciary, or of, rebuilding public trust in anti-corruption bodies, it takes a really long time. And so I think this is something in Hungary that we'll be watching to see whether the government, one, is able to do that, and two, whether they can, actually hold their promises that they ran on, especially around things like corruption, which I know is a very big thing that the government was able to campaign on. But it is, regardless, to see the over a decade of Fidesz and Viktor Orban's kind of repressive rule in Hungary come to an end is certainly a win for Hungary.
Did your reporting, your desk, follow the efforts that were made in Hungary to get to that point? I mean, we don't know about the future, but they did get across the line. They did oust Orban, and it was a huge effort.
Yes. And I think a lot of times where this starts is with civil society. Of course, politicians play a large role in this, but in Hungary, there's such a vibrant civil society who, for years, it didn't just happen recently, who have been integral in pushing back and raising the alarm around what has been happening. I mean, even as early as 2014, when Viktor Orban and Fidesz really consolidated power through their efforts to kind of gerrymander or kind of reshift kind of political lines to essentially ensure that they had kind of super majority in the parliament. There were different groups, watchdog or organizations and civil society who were calling that out. Independent journalists were calling that out. And of course, then the government went after those people because they were the ones who were holding them to account. But I think in the continuation and leading up to the elections, these were the groups who were mobilizing, who were getting voters organized. And I think not just in Hungary, but in places around the world where you do see countries who have spent, years under either autocratic rule or, in Hungary's case, kind of more liberal rule. Civil society is often kind of where it starts to, I'd say, like light the fire, have the spark to make the U-turn kind of back towards a hope, at least for a democratic resurgence.
Yeah, it takes everyday people working together collectively in the society and supporting the civil society, and if it's in its efforts, if they can't themselves get involved. It's quite inspiring that regardless of what happens next, that they manage to do that. I heard recently about what would you call it? A top tier university group of people in the world, of sort of world class university, and they're studying political science. And I heard this academic say that they were arguing. Now it was a group of students from around the world. Now arguing against democracy, and they were, the politicians of the future, and she was shocked by that, and so was I. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, if you don't have democracy, what is the choice? What are the options on the table? They're not very pretty, right? And I just wondered if you could just lay out for any listeners who might be thinking, yeah, I mean, of course, before we go further, just to sort of underline, democracy is not easy. It's never easy. It's constantly involves compromise, working things out together, trying to gather all kinds of disparate opinion, trying to work out difficult policy in a rapidly changing world. It's constantly a challenge. It's part of what democracy is. But the alternative. So I would love it if you don't mind just reflecting on the general characteristics when you lose a democracy. What does that look like in the world? What does that happen in your society? What are the kinds of things that go on typically when you don't have a democracy? Just think it's worthwhile just reflecting on what that's like. Would you mind just sharing the common characteristics?
Yeah, of course. And I think this is such an important question because, like you said, democracy is not easy. And I think we're in a time now in the US, in Europe, where you're seeing a lot of pushback to democracy and where, democracy, some leaders, is not delivering for people, or at least the version of democracy people are getting left behind. But that doesn't mean that democracy as a whole is not delivering. I think, it may be surprising for listeners that more than 2/5 of the world's population now lives in a authoritarian country. And for billions of people around the world, rights that many democratic societies take for granted, speaking freely, organizing politically, assessing independent news, are neither guaranteed nor secure. And I think, especially for people sitting where I sit, it's very important to kind of know exactly what the distinction is. So when we talk about a country, for example, being not free, we're talking about a lot more than elections. We're talking about whether ordinary people can speak openly. Self-censorship in a lot of these places becomes a way of life, I think, in a way that is completely unimaginable to people who live in democracies. So one of the defining features of authoritarian systems that people learn very on is what topics are unsafe to discuss. So citizens may avoid criticizing political leaders or sharing their opinions online, or even having conversations at work or in a taxi cab, or sometimes even in their own homes. And the goal of repression is not, to arrest every single person. Sometimes it's to make people so afraid that they silence themselves. I think the most, effective form of censorship is when a government makes the risk of speaking out so high that you decide to not speak out in the first place. I think one example of this that comes to mind often is in Saudi Arabia, where the government for so many years has made the risk of speaking out so high by sentencing people to absolutely absurd prison lengths, like 45 years in prison for something as innocuous as a Twitter post. I mean, just in the last year, we saw a man sentenced to death and executed for a social media post. And the message that this sends the rest of society is it simply is not worth it to speak out. And there is such an ingrained sense of fear among society. And I think it's really important, for people in democracies to understand that that is kind of what the level of self-censorship is in a lot of places around the world. Another thing, to go in a different direction is that you can't reliably hold leaders accountable. In democratic societies, citizens can vote leaders out of office, investigate wrongdoings through independent media, and then challenge abuses in the court system. And in autocracies, these mechanisms are either very weak or non-existent at all. And, I think maybe a misconception is that in autocracies, elections just simply don't occur. In a lot of places, they do, but they're very often manipulated. Opposition candidates are very often excluded. State institutions very rarely serve the people. They often just serve the people in power. Elections are typically just elections in name. They don't actually give people a meaningful choice. You can think about Russia. Russia holds elections frequently, but Vladimir Putin is the only one who wins. And often if you choose to challenge him, you're putting your own life at risk. People don't actually have a meaningful choice. This is why you see, in places like Egypt or Rwanda, where elections are held, the incumbent often wins with 99% of the vote share, which is, if you think about it, kind of absurd that someone would win with that much, but it's because they're either not being challenged or they're being challenged by kind of a sham opposition figure. These simply are not, credible competitive elections. And I guess just a couple more examples of, what life would be like. Information becomes a lot harder to trust. I think and goes back to our earlier conversation about some of the trends that we've been seeing. Media freedom is just absolutely coming under attack around the world. It's one of the indicators that we track in freedom in the world that's seen the largest decline over the last 20 years around the world. Independent journalists are being harassed, imprisoned, forced into exile. These attacks are coming in all different regime types, but specifically in the more not free repressive environments, you're seeing this very high level of risk against journalists. You also see state-controlled media dominate the information environment, so it's very hard to trust the information that you're getting. Propaganda is rampant, as well as censorship. So governments are going to block websites and censor social media, and then flood kind of the information space with disinformation. And of course, this is just being facilitated with the rise of AI, which will continue just to make this problem worse, and make it easier for governments to kind of use the online space as a tool of repression. And then I guess the last one that maybe I'll talk about is just the way that civil society is constrained. Oftentimes, organizations that work for human rights or women's rights or environmental groups or even organized labor, like unions, are either outright banned or heavily surveilled or curtailed. So it's very hard to kind of organize around these rights. There could also be very high kind of registration requirements. People who work in these places or activists face really high risks for doing this work. So these are just some of the examples. I'll stop there, but hopefully that kind of provides people with an idea.
Yeah, it's such a long, long list, and there's a lot more, isn't there? Like one I'll add, which comes to mind. I live in the United Kingdom, and the rule of law works in the United Kingdom. And in a lot of these countries that you describe, there is no equivalence. And if somebody accuses you, and perhaps you're trying to run in opposition to the government or trying to raise a critical voice, and they'll use the law as a weapon against you, and you don't have a foot to stand on, and the judges may be co-opted, and it's well, I think the expression is kangaroo court or something, but it's not a legal system that you can trust and you can rely on. And that's just such a huge insecurity to have in your life for yourself and your family and your community, to have a legal system that is non-existent or there's no such thing as everybody being treated equally before the law.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's such a long list. Cathryn, before we go, we like to include at the end of every interview a question for our guests around individual agency. So for people listening, wherever they are in the world, who might like to get more engaged in their democracy, or they're trying to build some kind of democracy in a place where it barely exists, or they're worried about their democracy, they can see the dangers and they are worried about it and would like to do something about it themselves or together with others in a group in their community. Just wondered if you had any ideas to share or suggestions, things you've seen in your work that people can safely do to beyond casting a vote.
Yeah. I think the easy one that I always say is to vote. But I think lessons from countries that have successfully defended or expanded freedom and democracy is that democracy is strongest when citizens participate between elections, not just on election day. And I mean, you mentioned what people can do as a group. I think one kind of simple and social way to do this is to join something. This is whether it's like a neighborhood association, even, and it doesn't need to be political. It can be a parent-teacher organization, volunteer club, a faith community, a labor union, or an advocacy organization, volunteer for something. Anything that kind of builds networks these sort of networks are what makes democratic societies resilient. I think often we see authoritarian governments targeting, I was just mentioning, these kinds of independent organizations precisely because they create the space for citizens to organize outside of state control. Being able to create these spaces and continue to build these foundational groups is so important. Democracy, we're talking about this with, I think, the Hungary example. It doesn't begin in parliament or in kind of the legislative branch. It begins in communities where people live and work together and solve problems. That's where people are able to hold leaders accountable. It's from the ground up. So I think that's one important way. Another, and I was mentioning, one of the biggest threats currently to freedom is the attack on media freedom. Supporting independent journalism is so incredibly important. It is the first line of defense against corruption, abuse of power, disinformation. Journalists are the ones who are, keeping people informed and holding leaders to account. If you are able to, supporting your local news organizations, subscribing to investigative outlets and sharing credible reporting, this is also just such an important way to continue to push back against the increasing spread of dis and misinformation. It's really hard to hold power accountable if you don't know what the power is doing. And then I guess the last one is probably just engaging locally. There's so much attention around national politics, but many democratic institutions operate on the local level, school boards, city council meetings. Being able to engage kind of at that level, I think sometimes get forgotten. But I think local communities are where the health of democracy often starts, not, around the world. And so again, kind of going back to what I was saying at the beginning, that is where a lot of this starts. And it's kind of a small way and a less intimidating way to kind of get started.
And one of the weapons autocrats use is othering people. And if you're engaged in your community and it's a diverse community and, you're less inside perhaps a bubble of any kind, or you're interacting with the diverse groups, it's really hard to be able to hook people into an othering campaign if communities are vibrant and diverse and working together. And what are you talking about? They're my friends. There was something you said when we were preparing and chatting before this interview about Bhutan. And before we go, I just wanted to work out flag Bhutan, because I know that you said there was something you wanted to say about it, and I just wanted to wave the Bhutan flag before we finish the interview. What was it you wanted to share?
Yes. Yeah. This is one of my favorite examples of kind of countries that have made pretty remarkable steps to go from more autocratic kind of forms of government to democratic forms of government. So Bhutan is one of, I think, the only countries in our index who has moved from the not free status to the free status in the last 50 years. So again, it speaks to that point I was making, that building up democracy after years of autocracy takes a long time, but it can be done. And if listeners don't know, Bhutan is a very small country, kind of nestled north of India in Asia, but in 2024, it joined the ranks of consolidated democracies after 2 decades of consolidating its democracy slowly over time through credible elections and transfers of power to the opposition. And it wasn't just through elections. I mean, elections is often where kind of this momentum towards democracy starts, but it was also because consecutive governments continue to prioritize civil liberties, improving physical security, improving media freedom, improving the ability for people to have freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And while it did take decades, we are now seeing Bhutan freedom is flourishing in Bhutan. And so I always like to highlight that example because it's not a country that a lot of people, I think of often or even know about, but it is one of the success stories for democracy around the world.
It sounds like a great story. I am fascinated by that, and I would like to know all about how that happened. So I think we're going to have to do an episode on Bhutan. Thank you so much for joining us today. That was a fascinating insight into democracy and autocracy, and really appreciate your time. Thank you, Cathryn.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on.
Bye for now. If you enjoyed this episode, please post a review or rating. We're new, and a one-line review has a huge impact in helping others to find us. Thank you for your support.